Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever time of the day it happens to be while you're watching. My name is Matt Doyle. I'm a UK-based author and occasional voice actor, and this is my Cabinet of Curios, where we look at horror media that is, in terms of the UK at least, a little bit unusual or obscure, or sometimes just plain underrated. We're hopefully back to normal this week, so we should have some nice visuals from what we're going to be looking at, so rather than just my mug for a change. I need to apologise in case you can see any sweat dripping off me, or in case I sound a little bit washed out. I have just got back from the cinema from watching Deadpool and Wolverine, and the AC was broken in the rather packed screen that I was in. So it was lovely and hot, and plenty of bodies around to keep the heat up, but I enjoyed myself, so that's what matters. Now, this time around we're going to be doing something a little bit different to normal. Previous episodes we've been looking at films, mostly older ones I think. This time around we are going to be looking at a TV series. Not only that, but it is a TV series that is more horror adjacent rather than outright horror. And that is, of course, the 1970s ITV production Sapphire Steel, which is generally thought of as a sci-fi series, but we're going to look at why I believe horror has kind of got its spooky little claws deep in that show. So, let's begin. Sapphire Steel was produced by ITV in the UK and ran from 1979 to 1982 with a total of 6 assignments spread over multiple episodes. The show was created by PJ Hammond, who's a mainstay of British television writing. He's worked on everything from soap operas like The Bill, Emmerdale and EastEnders to things like Midsummer Murders, The Ruth Rendell Mysteries and the Doctor Who spin-off Torchwood. In 2018, he also released his first novel, Downtimers. Sapphire Steel was inspired by his time staying in an allegedly haunted castle. To that end, rather than being a standard sci-fi series, it ended up blending a science fiction premise with what were essentially ghost stories. The original title was set to be The Time Menders, and it was intended to be a sort of 9 o'clock sort of showing of a children's show. In that respect, you could view it as possibly being intended to be the ITV equivalent of Doctor Who, but I don't think that was ever entirely the intention, and I do feel like it would be selling it short somewhat. Doctor Who is, of course, one of the great success stories of British media, and rightly so. Since 1963, it's been a consistent dose of family sci-fi with a few light scares and a fair bit of reflection of the modern world. Sapphire Steel is a very different beast, though. In fact, in an interview on The Twilight Language of Nigel Neal, the excellent author China Mayville mentioned it as the strangest thing ever screened on British TV. You see, this is a show that deals with some very dark themes, and it does so in a very peculiar way. While the aforementioned Doctor has a whole bevy of lore and backstory and rules that can be drawn upon, Sapphire Steel was actually very scant on detail. The only real hint as to what the titular characters are is presented in the dialogue that plays during each episode. In that, it says, "All irregularities will be handled by the forces controlling each dimension. Transuranic heavy elements may not be used where there is life. Medium atomic weights are available. Gold, lead, copper, jet, diamond, radium, sapphire, silver, and steel. Sapphire Steel have been assigned." What does that tell us, really? That these are some sort of trans-dimensional detectives or operators, as they describe themselves, sent to deal with irregularities in the general world. And that concept has been utilised a lot in recent times when it comes to indie horror video games. Observation Duty and Platform 8, for example, sets the players against strange happenings in their environments. In Platform 8, they're designed to prompt you to turn back. In Observation Duty, the irregularities must be spotted and reported on camera so that they can be fixed. I'm not saying that these games or others like them were directly inspired by Sapphire Steel, of course. I just like that there is some thematic crossover. It gives me hope that a new generation may discover this absolute gem of a series. But what kind of irregularities are encountered, and how do these make the series horror adjacent, if not just outright spook-worthy? I'm going to look at each of the 6 assignments in order, so it's only fair to note that there will be spoilers here. If it's a series that you do want to watch without knowing what's going to happen, turn back now, come back later. You have been warned. It is the first assignment that alone bears the remnants of the family entertainment concept that was around at the beginning of the creation of the series. This assignment is set in a house where a corridor of time has interfered with general living. If that sounds odd, it's because it is odd. Sapphire explains time to one of the children in the story as, there is a corridor, and the corridor is time. It surrounds all things and passes through all things. You can't see it, only sometimes. Then it's dangerous. She goes on to explain that you can't enter the corridor, not in the way that you would think of with entering a corridor, but when the corridor weakens and cracks, time can burst into the present and take things and people. And that's what has happened here, as the operators have been assigned to get to the bottom of the disappearance of the parents of the two children. And so we learn that time itself and the creatures therein have used ancient triggers to enter the present day. These triggers were things like old nursery rhymes, ancient brickwork, and paintings, all things that linked to the past and allowed it to use past tragedies to invade the space. In the end, the operators are able, with the help of lead, to freeze the entities in place and destroy their entry point. What makes this a family episode is a combination of the sympathetic victims being children and the happy ending, neither of which are things that you should get used to at all. From here, it gets a lot more bleak. One thing I really enjoyed, though, was that there was kind of a hint of Lovecraft creeping in here. The unknowable element of time, the creatures within that we never really see and are told that we can't possibly understand. You know, there were hints that this was a darker series than anticipated, and it wasted no time in diving headlong into that bleak tone for Assignment 2. See here, this is more of a classic ghost story. It's set in an abandoned train station, and Sapphire and Steel encounter an old medium, Tully, who's carrying out paranormal research, having encountered the ghost of a young World War I soldier. As the episodes march on, we're introduced to various other spirits who all harbour resentment for their early demises, such as the pilot whose plane crashed because nobody would fly with him, or the people who were trapped on a sunken submarine who felt that they never should have been there. It being a low-budget show, the visual atmosphere is mostly maintained via lighting, and then enhanced with the cries of the spirits as they relive the moments that link them to their resentment and force the heroes to join them in doing so. So the first assignment told us three things. The entities within time are dangerous, Sapphire is empathetic, and Steel is cold and calculating. Here we also get to learn that the operators are vulnerable. Both almost died during the investigation thanks to the ghosts, which is itself a setup for their confrontation with the unseen creature that's using the soldier specifically to gather resentful spirits at the railway station. See, it's a creature that feeds on resentment, and the departed are cattle being led to the slaughter with the promise of a release, which is of course an empty promise. Now the spirits are released. Sapphire and Steel see to that, but don't mistake that for a happy ending. While Steel does check whether he would be missed and show some humanity in doing so, he ultimately makes the decision to sacrifice Tully to the darkness within the station. He argues that a living soul, not due to die for another 5 years, would have far more resentment than all the spirits that have been gathered put together. They all died at their allotted time. So a trade is made. And the implication here is that as humans, we have a pre-assigned time to die. We cannot change that ourselves. We can only march unknowingly towards it. But those outside our existence, including those that are technically on our side, can change it for their purposes. We're not alone. And those that walk beside us, even the ones that are friendly, are not kind. Assignment 3 is generally thought of as a disappointment by fans. At the very least, it's one of the ones that tends to have a bit of a mixed reaction. It's more of a science fiction story than anything, and features a family of far future historians that have travelled back in time to study the then modern day. It has a pillow that attacks the characters by floating comically across the room and then projecting itself as an angry swan, for example. This is where the low budget really kind of strikes in a way that is very off-putting, and it is absolutely as ludicrous as it sounds. I would say, though, that the episode is not really as bad as it's sometimes remembered. There are some fun concepts at play here. The antagonist is the angry amalgamation of multiple dead animals. You see, in the future, humans have moved beyond relying on meat for sustenance, and they also view themselves as morally greater than those in 1980. However, the price of this is that animals are a thing of the past. They're viewed as not really worthwhile because we're not using them as food anymore, and they're too dirty to be pets. So they just don't exist. Other than a few that are lab-created chunks of animal used for experimentation. In this instance, it's a couple of those chunks that were put together and used to power the time travel device utilised by the future researchers. And this has resulted in the deaths of several groups, and very nearly the ones encountered by Sapphire and Steel too. There's a strange balance here, because it does show that some things have improved morally and technologically in the future, but that some of the things deemed normal in the enlightened future also seem repugnant to the present day person. And this is a cycle that obviously you see play out in modern day in real life all the time. We also get introduced in this story to the technician, Silver, and we get to see hints of a past relationship with him and Sapphire, along with Steel displaying a touch of jealousy towards him. There are definite gaps in Steel's knowledge of human culture beginning to show here too, and Sapphire, as much as she is kind of and Steel, is also fairly cold in her analysis at times. Another nice touch was Steel got to display some brute strength by twisting the cables of a lift, or an elevator if you prefer. So it's not an entirely worthless adventure. Assignment 4, on the other hand, is actually my favourite of the bunch, and I'm certainly not alone in that. The titular pair are sent to investigate an old building here that's apparently haunted by Victorian children. As it transpires, the children are taken from photographs, and once you realise this, you start to notice some of the clever little low-budget tricks at play. The children are coloured like old photographs. Some are black and white, some are tinted orange and brown. It's a subtle but effective use of colour. In this case, we find the owner of the building was a hobbyist photographer. He liked to experiment and try clever things with old-fashioned photography equipment, and as a result, he accidentally created the door for the Faceless Man. This creature is the first that we get to see clearly, both in its various disguises and in its faceless form. Now again, this is a low-budget mask, but it works for what is needed. This ancient creature has apparently been present since the dawn of photography, with a little bit of its life essence present in every shot ever taken, and now it's stealing people from photographs and tearing time apart as a consequence. There are some things to note here. We never learn why the creature takes children in particular from photographs specifically, but it does not act in any way sinister towards them. In that respect, you can't really view it as entirely bad. Boy, is it capable of being so. We do see it capture two people in an old photograph, physically removing them from their time and displacing them into an old world, trapped in place but conscious and able to communicate with Sapphire. We also hear them scream as the Faceless Man burns the photograph, burning them to death in the process, completely unable to move or escape the flames. And the worst part is the Faceless Man cannot be defeated. It's too powerful to be destroyed. Instead, Sapphire and Steel trap it and vow to stow it away in a ship that's due to sink, meaning it will be trapped for 75 years in the ice. After that, it'll be free again, and the operators will need to be present to trap it once more. Would you be dead in 75 years after its first reign of terror? Possibly. But that won't matter. If a photograph of you exists, it can find you. If you're already dead, it can pull you into the world and hurt you anyway. Are the ones taken from the photographs really the same as those were alive? Do the photos contain little fragments of our souls? We never find out. All we know is that this thing can get us, even if we're long gone from the world. That takes us on to Assignment 5, which is the other one that tends to be a little bit mixed with fans. It's a very different tone again. It plays out like an old-fashioned murder mystery, but with time displacement. An eccentric millionaire is holding a party to celebrate 50 years of success for the foundation he created with his former business partner, the deceased Dr. George McD. His friends and family gather along with an infiltrating Sapphire and Steel, and then things start getting weird. See, Dr. McD was working on some revolutionary medical science that he believed would cure many, if not all, diseases, but he died during a fire before he could complete the work. So imagine the shock for the guests when he suddenly turns up at the party. Time is moving backwards in chunks. If the guest wasn't present in the 1930s, or they were not yet born, first they start to be worked into the narrative as analogues for people who were present when the tragedy occurred. Then they die in a mysterious way. Or rather, we learn they don't entirely die. They simply get booted from the timeline and end up temporarily in the realm of Sapphire and Steel, left to look in from the outside while things play out. In this instance, we learn that the jilted lover of Dr. McD actually shot him rather than see him remain with his wife. Now she has been offered the chance to change this by an unknown entity. The problem is, unbeknownst to her, this would have terrible consequences. Dr. McDee's work would indeed cure many diseases, but the technology and science to make it work properly in the way he intends isn't yet present. As a result, it would soon lead to the rise of a supervirus that wipes out all of humanity. Sapphire and Steel cannot prevent this from happening entirely without altering the timeline in a big way. So they're left with trying to appeal to the humanity of the lover, hoping they can convince her to let things play out as they're supposed to. It's a story about a moral quandary, love, and the supernatural. Finally, we came to Assignment 6. Sapphire and Steel arrived to help Silver at a roadside diner. This is unusual, as Silver is a technician and so should not be in place until after a team of operators has done their work. As they investigate, we see multiple people appear that are outside their timeline. There's an old man from the 1920s, a couple from the 1940s, and a travelling performer from the 1950s. That performer, in particular, Johnny Jack, is bloody creepy. Played by Christopher Fairbank, who's appeared in The Fifth Element, Guardians of the Galaxy, Andor, and all sorts of other things. Johnny Jack is a painted-faced, raggedy-dressed musician. He has dolls adorning his clothes, which he tells us are his family. Here comes I, little Johnny Jack, with all me family on me back. Me family's large, me wife is small, and I'm the father of them all. Got a kiss for Johnny Jack, and all the children on his back. I know there are people who watched this show that didn't like the character at all and thought he was kind of out of place, but for me, he was a wrong-un in a way that made him so creepy, and I appreciate him all the more for it. I absolutely love that he appears in this. Anyway, we do learn that the three males that appear displaced are actually transient beings. They're powerful, more so than our heroes, but generally are not allowed to interfere in the present day. They're more unpredictable and tend to be assigned to a point in the past and remain there. Now, something has given them a tool to get to the present with orders to get rid of Sapphire and Steel. We never get an actual confirmation of who was in charge of the villains, but Steel believes that they may have been sent due to something being jealous of the pair's freedom to work as they wish. And, you know, they've certainly bent the rules in their travels, such as when Steel sacrificed Tully, or the times that Sapphire, who is the nice one, remember, has outright controlled humans with her brain. So there are some viewers who take the big boss of the elements overall to be the one giving orders to Johnny Jack and company. In the end, Silver is offered a deal by the transient beings, which he refuses. However, not being the target, his face is left open when all is said and done. Sapphire and Steel, though, are transported back to the diner by the 1940s man, who by this time is the only transient being still standing. See, Silver made a copy of their tool, a little wooden box, and it's been used to send the old man and Johnny Jack back in time where they belong, or to the Triassic period in the case of Johnny Jack. Finally, the heroes learn that the human woman from the 1940s was not being manipulated as they thought. She'd shown signs of being scared of her companion and seemingly spilled part of the plan to the heroes, but she was working alongside the transient beings all along. And as the two of them depart, the heroes are left trapped in the diner in the wrong time and now floating aimlessly in space with no way to get home. As I understand it, the next story was written, but changes with licensing combined with lower numbers than the TV company wanted meant it was never filmed. I do think that's a shame, as we'd never really got a proper conclusion to the arc. In a way, that is kind of fitting, though. This is a weird series that never really explained everything, so to end in the same way feels very on-brand. Not that it ended entirely, of course. There were multiple audio dramas produced in the early 2000s. I haven't heard them myself, but I understand that they don't really broach what happened between them and the end of Assignment 6. I know that the two stars, Joanna Lumley and David McCallum, chose not to reprise their roles for the dramas. Both went on to far bigger things after the series, and that was well deserved. Their work here was excellent, in my opinion, so all the success that followed for them was more than earned. From what I hear, the two that were casted as Sapphire and Steel in the audio dramas do a great job as well, so it's something that I will check out eventually. So, overall, I am aware that this is not going to be a show for everybody. Certainly, if you don't get along with low-budget productions, you are going to cringe your way through all of it, because there really isn't much of a budget in sight. The soundtrack as well does have its problems. You know, there's a couple of like little musical stings that are done on a xylophone, or I think at some points a glockenspiel. and there's a couple of very generic sci-fi noises that don't really fit with the tone that I feel it was going for. The same goes if you prefer loose ends to be at the very least mostly tied up by the end of a story, because this intentionally avoids doing so, in my opinion, probably as part of portraying the concept of time as never-ending and unknowable. Equally, if you saw it as an old British sci-fi show and were expecting another Doctor Who, it's going to disappoint because it is a very different animal to the Doctor and his adventures. The key is to understand that it's a horror-adjacent show with one foot in a sci-fi concept and the other in more of a traditional British ghost story. It's for people who are fans of things like the Stone Tapes or the old Christmas horror stories that adapted the works of M.R. James. It's not a neat and tidy package overall, but the nature of the stories means it somehow fits regardless. And honestly, I love it. I love that it doesn't finish its thoughts. I love that the cast took it so seriously despite the on-off degrees of campiness and a lack of budget. I love that it dared to be different than its contemporaries. It's one of those shows that if the opportunity to voice a character in one of the official radio dramas came about, I would absolutely leap at it. So, if you get the chance, do check it out. Go in with an open mind. Try not to be put off by the mainly family-friendly nature of the first adventure. Persevere. Let the bleakness grow. And let me know what you think. Later.